Are you ready to feel the burn?
Thanks, one and all. Please be seated. Let me start with an issue that I know you're really eager to talk about this week, and that has to do...
Stormy Daniels.
That has to do with...
You got it.
That has to do with the banking bill in the Senate that several of your colleagues on the Democratic caucus joined with Republicans to pass. It makes a lot of changes to Dodd-Frank that I know you are very opposed to. A lot of the Democrats who are up for re-election this year in states that Trump won voted with the Republicans on this. Why are they wrong?
Well, before I get to that, I want to get to that important issue. What I want to do today is something a little bit different than what Jake and I do when I go on your State of the Union show. Because when we go on State of the Union, what do we usually have, 7-8 minutes or something like that?
We often make an exception for you, make it 11 or 12.
To talk about all of the issues facing Western civilization. So I want to answer all of Jake's questions, but I want to broaden the discussion today to talk about things that are not usually talked about on mainstream media. All right? I'm not Donald Trump, and I don't think Jake and the overwhelming majority of journalists are into fake news, or they hate people, and they're trying to destroy people. He works very, very hard, and he does a good job. Good night. On the other hand, a lot of what TV is about is kind of gotcha stuff and conflict stuff and sensationalism, and we don't talk about the most important issues facing the working people of this country: the collapse of the American middle class, income and wealth inequality, the movement of this country toward oligarchy, the fact that we have a handful of billionaires like the Koch brothers who are undermining American democracy and trying to buy elections. Those issues often we don't talk about on television, and I want to do that today. But to answer Jake's very important question, there's a bill right now on the floor of the United States Senate, which essentially would deregulate, go a long way toward deregulating 35 out of the 50 largest banks in this country. And I am unalterably opposed to deregulating banks that have assets up to $250 billion, because it seems insane to me that we have forgotten what happened 10 years ago when the greed and recklessness and illegal behavior of Wall Street drove this country into the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. So to my mind, you don't deregulate these large banks that have in many instances been fined for illegal behavior. In fact, what we have to do is take a look at the banking system and understand that the major banks are much larger today than they were before we bailed them out because they were too big to fail. So what I would like to see is us breaking up the large financial institutions, not deregulating them, and putting them in a position, as the Congressional Budget Office just noted, to make them more likely to fail and be open for another taxpayer bailout. So I am very, very strongly opposed to that. Other point that I would make on this one, Jake, we can talk about why some Democrats, I think there are 14 who are supporting this bill. I strongly disagree with that. But let's also ask ourselves a question, and that is, given the crises facing this country, given the fact that all over America, people are very upset about the kind of gun violence we saw in Florida, that we have seen all over this country. People are asking, how come we're not dealing with the issue of gun safety on the floor of the Senate? How come we're not dealing with the issue of DACA and immigration reform on the floor of the Senate? How come we're doing what Wall Street and the big banks want us to do? And that gets us to the issue. That gets us to the issue that I hope we will discuss today, and that is the power of money in politics, and the fact that last year alone, financial institutions spent $200 million in lobbying the Congress, and over a period of 25 years, spent billions of dollars in campaign contributions.
I would like to go just a little deeper on the banking bill. I do want to get to gun violence and DACA as well. One of the reasons why this bill from Mike Crapo was offered was there are smaller small credit unions and smaller banks, a lot of them in rural communities that didn't have the resources, they said, to comply with all the regulations. And even Barney Frank, who wrote the Dodd-Frank bill, said that he thought that the limit should be raised. It was at $50 billion. Any bank with $50 billion in assets or more had to comply with these regulations. This new bill would raise that to $250 billion. Right. Even Barney Frank said he thought it should probably be raised to about $125 billion. He's with you. He opposes this change, but he did think it should be raised. Is there a limit? Do you think that there should be any increase?
Fair question. And here's what very often happens in Washington, and it happened on the Trump Republican tax bill as well. Do credit unions, who are very important in my rural state, are they concerned about having to spend too much time, especially if they're really a small institution, spending too much time and money in regulation? The answer is yes. We should deal with that. But what goes on in this bill, as well as what went on in the tax bill, is that in the name of trying to help the small little credit unions or the community banks, what they are primarily doing is helping some of the very largest banks and financial institutions in this country. And in terms of tax reform, they did the same thing. They said, okay, we're going to give you $100 a year, $200 a year in a tax break, but we're giving the billionaires, Koch brothers, will get over $1 billion a year in tax breaks. So to answer your question, the focus should have been on small banks, on community banks, to see how we can help them, not deregulating some of the very largest financial institutions in this country, some of whom played a role in destroying our economy 10 years ago, leaving millions of people without jobs, homes, or life savings.
Would you have raised the limit to $125 billion or something like that?
It's something that we should have discussed, but the primary focus should have been on credit unions and small banks, not large financial institutions.
Let's talk about gun violence, since you brought it up as something you wish that the Senate were taking up this week. What kind of legislation do you think the United States Senate should have passed if you were king of the
Very
Senate?
important question. And I'll tell you something. I think there has been a sea change, and I don't know why. Maybe it's simply after Parkland and after Las Vegas, maybe the American people were just shaking their heads and saying, we're sick and tired of this, and we just don't want to see children. I mean, it's almost too unspeakable to talk about what happens in what we have seen in Sandy Hook or in Parkland of children being shot down. Here is the good news. And one of the themes that I want to be discussing today with Jake is that on issue after issue, whether it is the need for immigration reform or banking reform or gun violence issues, the truth is the American people are by and large not divided. The truth is that on many of the major economic issues and social issues facing the country, most Americans stand together. Problem is we often have small groups, whether it is Wall Street or the NRA, who exercise enormous power. So in terms of gun violence, what are some of the common sense, not particularly radical ideas that the American people support that I support? Do many people in America, Jake, think that it makes sense that if somebody is on a terrorist watch list, which prevents them from getting on an airplane because we're afraid what they would do on an airplane, that they can go out into a gun shop and buy a gun? Very few people think that makes sense. So what we want to do is greatly expand background checks to make sure that people with serious mental illness, with criminal backgrounds, people who have been involved in domestic violence, people who might be using those weapons to kill fellow Americans, they do not get those guns, okay? Expanding background checks. Issue number two, If you walk into a gun shop in Texas or Vermont today, you go through a background check. But if there is a gun show, you can buy weapons without going through that background check, and many people do. Most people, including gun owners, do not think that makes sense. You want to do away with the so-called gun show loophole. Third area, you can legally go into a gun shop and buy a bunch of weapons legally with a background check, and then you sell those guns to gang members or drug dealers, and that's so-called straw man provision, which we have to eliminate. Fourth area where there is a difference of opinion in this country. I think a majority now support it. I have supported this provision for 30 years. Not everybody does. I happen to believe that assault weapons are military weapons designed to kill human beings. I think they should be banned for sale and distribution.
Now, a lot of people know you're from Vermont, which is a state where there are a lot of gun owners. And as came out during the Democratic primaries in 2016, there were times that you voted for provisions supported by the NRA. You voted against the Brady Bill. You voted in favor of giving gun manufacturers immunity from lawsuits. Do you regret any of those votes?
There's a long and complicated votes, but what I will say is that 30 years ago, in 1988, Vermont is not Texas. We only have one member of the Congress. I ran in a three-way race against the Democrat and Republican. Democrat and Republican both supported assault weapons. I was the only candidate to say we should ban them. I lost that election by 3 votes. I have a D- lifetime voting record from the NRA. So you can go back over 25 or 30 years and look at this or that vote, and the Brady Bill was a complicated vote because I wanted to see us move aggressively toward background checks. But coming from a state that has virtually zero gun control as of today, that may change, by the way, in the next couple of weeks or months. I am proud of my record in terms of guns.
DACA, you brought up, obviously that's an issue of significance for a lot of people, probably many people in this room. President Trump says there is a deal on the table for Democrats to deal with him in DACA, a deal where he would make significant changes to the immigration laws, but it is a deal that would provide a path to at least legal status, if not citizenship, for 1.8 million individuals, including those in DACA and those eligible for DACA. What's your response to him, and is there a deal to be done here?
Look, the problem with Donald Trump, one of the many problems with Donald Trump, is that, and again, you know, I am one of the fiercest anti-Trump members of the Congress, but it gives me no pleasure to say this. It really does not, to say that he lies all of the time. That's just the fact. He lies day after day, and what he says on Monday is not necessarily what he will say on Tuesday. We had legislation a month ago on the floor of the Senate that I reluctantly voted for, reluctantly. And what that legislation said is that there will be legal status, as you indicated, for the 1.8 million. There are 800,000 people in the DACA program, another million eligible for the program. Legal status for those people and a path toward citizenship in exchange for money to build a wall, which I happen to think is one of the stupidest ideas in the history of the world. All right? But I voted for that very reluctantly because I am deeply concerned about what will happen to these young people who are now in the process of beginning to face the possibility of deportation, which would be a moral outrage. So there was that legislation. And you know what Trump did and his Department of Homeland Security did on the day of that bill was going to come to a vote? They lobbied very, very heavily against it. So Trump precipitated this crisis, as you know, by revoking Obama's executive order. His attitude toward undocumented people in this country has been an absolute outrage. He has used the undocumented as a political tool to fan his xenophobic base, and I think that that is a disgrace. So we are going to work as hard as we can to fight for comprehensive immigration reform, for a path towards citizenship for the undocumented, and certainly as quickly as we can, hopefully soon, provide legal protection to these young people who desperately need it.
As you know, in order for an immigration bill to become law, it would not only need to get 60 votes, at least initially, in the Senate, where Democrats are in the minority, 51 votes, including Senator Sanders, and then it also would have to pass the House, to say nothing of President Trump being willing to sign it. They want more, the Republicans, President Trump. They want more than just the wall. They want to change immigration law so that there isn't as much, there aren't as many visas for family reunification, so that the diversity visa lottery program is ended. Is there any room in the Democratic caucus for any of those compromises?
Let me just say this. It gets back to the point I tried to make a moment ago. On this issue, and I know CNN does a lot of polling, and you correct me if I'm wrong, on this issue of providing legal protection and a path towards citizenship for the 1.8 million people in DACA or eligible for DACA, some of the last polls, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake, 75, 80% of the American people said, yes, we will not turn our backs on these young people. So the overwhelming majority of the American people want to see us provide legal protection. And by the way, a majority of the American people, pretty strong majority, do not want us to build a wall. Now, all these other issues are issues that reluctantly I might be forced to discuss. But right now, the immediate concern, if you want to do comprehensive immigration reform, it's a huge issue. We should do it. We are not going to do it right now. Right now, the issue is providing legal protection to 1.8 million young people in the DACA program or eligible for that.
There are people in the progressive community who believe that the Democrats in the Senate, who have some power, as opposed to the Democrats in the House who really don't have any, just because of the rules of the Senate versus the House, should just stop any action until the DACA recipients are protected.
Well, I voted, I'll give you an example, the way I voted in that, with that perspective. There was as you know, a budget settlement last month, which I fought very hard, played a very active role in putting things in like doubling the amount of money for the child care development block grant program, something, we have a major child care crisis, $4 billion more into the Veterans Administration to do long-needed repairs, beginning to deal with the crisis of student debt in this country. Got $4 billion into that. Got money to protect the Social Security Administration. It was a reasonably good bill. I voted against that bill that I helped write. You know why? Precisely because of the DACA issue. So we are, as you've indicated, we have 49 votes. Republicans have 51 votes. Our job right now is to do everything we can to make sure that these young DACA people are protected.
I want to ask about some of the tensions in the Democratic/progressive community. You sat down with the Texas Tribune this week, and referring to how the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the establishment organization for the Democratic Party that works to elect Democrats to the House, their campaign against Laura Moser in the 7th Congressional District here in Texas, you called it outrageous. Why was it outrageous?
I'll tell you why. I think the average American is disgusted with the current political process. And that is what politics is supposed to be about, is for candidates to sit down, you and I, you're not a candidate, but in having serious discussions about the serious issues facing the American people. Why are we the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care for all people? Let's have that debate. Why do we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs while the pharmaceutical industry makes unbelievable profits? Why are hundreds of thousands of young people unable to afford to go to college and others leaving school $50,000 or $100,000 in debt? Right? There are a million issues out there that we should be discussing, but what politics is increasingly about, and I have to say, media plays a bad role in this. This is what politics is about. You want to run for office? You want to run for the United States Congress? First thing you should expect is your opponent will spend a lot of money doing opposition research on you. You know what that means, opposition research? It means going through every personal aspect of your life from the day you were born to see if they can come up with something stupid that you may have said, or maybe something personal about you or your kids or your family. And then they'll run a 30-second ad saying, somebody said this stupid thing, vote for the other guy. And the major issues facing the American people, why the middle class is in decline, or why we have 3 people in America owning more wealth than the bottom half of the American people, or why we are not effectively dealing with climate change. Those issues will not be talked about. So I detest that type of politics, and I think most Americans do. And then when you have the DCCC, Democratic Campaign Conference Committee, actually doing opposition research on a serious and strong candidate for the United States Congress, where the DCCC, the Democrat establishment itself, is engaging in negative attacks against a responsible candidate, that is, to my mind, absolutely unacceptable and has got to end.
Now, just to play devil's advocate, the DCCC, their argument would be that their job is getting Democrats elected in November, and they want to make sure that the strongest candidate possible gets the nomination.
And who knows who that strong, look, let me get a little bit personal here. Having gone through a little bit of that myself. You know, you want to know who the strongest candidate in that district is? Let the people of that district make that decision. And you want to know who the strongest candidate in a Democratic presidential primary is? Let the people of America make that decision, not a handful of people in Washington.
Well, let me ask you, because you brought it up.
Stormy Daniels.
No. You keep mentioning her name.
Not as much as CNN does.
We could talk about it in a minute, but I do want to ask you about the fact that it's whether it's the superdelegates, according to the system that the Democrats have, or the fact that, as evidenced by WikiLeaks, there were people within the Democratic National Committee who were, at the very least, discussing ways to hurt your campaign. Do you think that the playing field wasn't fair, and do you think that you could have beaten Donald Trump?
Well, the answer is nobody knows your last question. What I can say is that, as you recall, many of the polls did have me ahead of Trump, doing better than Clinton was. But those are polls, and we don't know what happens after zillions of dollars are spent on ads and so forth. Look, I'm not a great fan of looking back. My goal right now, being in Texas, is to make sure that we significantly increase voter turnout for 2018. You recall that and one of the things that I did campaign on, Jake, as you recall, what I called was a political revolution, was transforming American politics, was getting more people running for office, more people voting, more people involved, not only in campaigns, but in other ways to try to transform this country. And we're having pretty good success at that. We've got a lot more to be done. But to answer your question about the rules of the Democratic Party, we are working and have worked very hard. Actually, Clinton and I came together. We formed a Democratic Reform Commission How do you reform the Democratic Party to make it more open, more vibrant, more welcoming of ordinary people? And one of the virtually unanimous conclusions out of that committee was that the number of superdelegates be reduced by 60%, which I think is absolutely correct. I would reduce them by 100%. There were also some other changes about how we run open primaries. Most of the people in America, for well understandable reasons, are not Democrats or Republicans. Many of them see themselves as independents. Should they be allowed to get into Democratic primaries and cast their vote? The answer is yes. Some states make it very hard, reforming caucuses and so forth. So I think some reasonably good recommendations came out of the Reform Committee, and I hope, and will do everything I can to make sure that the DNC adopts those regulations.
I want to turn to an issue that does not get a lot of attention either at the U.S. Senate or in the media, and that has to do with the involvement of the United States in this proxy war in Yemen that's going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the United States providing not just weapons, but also other means of support for the Saudi government. You've introduced new legislation with Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut, that would remove most U.S. forces from Yemen, stop assistance for Saudi-led forces there. The intervention, by the way, began under President Obama, and the three of you, the three senators, have been critical of it during then and as well as now under President Trump. But let me be frank, is there any chance that it will even be voted on? Will the Senate even bring it up?
I think there will be a vote. Now, maybe it'll be a vote to table, but I think there will be a vote. Our opponents may want to just simply table it. But here is the issue, and I thank you for raising it, because it doesn't get a lot of attention. Yemen, tiny, well, it's not so tiny, there's about 20 million people in it, but it's a very, very poor country. I think it's fair to say most Americans are not focused on Yemen. But what you got here are two fundamental issues. And this is an issue where I'm working with a very conservative Republican, Mike Lee of Utah. And that is, I think over the years, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, Congress has abdicated its constitutional responsibility with regard to war. All of you know that the Constitution is very clear. It's not a president who declares war, it is the United States Congress. And Congress has abdicated that and allowed presidents to take the initiative in sending troops abroad. So what we are saying, number one, if the president wants to be involved, whether it was Obama or whether it is Trump, wants to be involved in the horribly destructive war in Yemen, they need authority from the United States Congress, and the Congress has got to vote yes or no on giving them that authority. That's number one. And the fear here is that if we don't stand up and reassert congressional authority, you're going to have a president, whether it's Trump or anybody else, just saying, hey, well, I'm concerned about over here. I'm going to send troops over there. Nobody has to know about it. We'll be involved over there. That's, by the way, the start of what the war in Vietnam was about. So, A, most importantly, reassert congressional authority. Number two, what's going on in Yemen itself in terms of the Saudi-led war. In Yemen right now, 10,000 people are dead, 40,000 have been wounded, 1 million people are now suffering from a cholera epidemic, and the United Nations tells us we're looking at one of the great humanitarian disasters of our time in terms of famine. The Saudis are playing a terrible role in trying to prevent food from coming into Yemen, and people are starving right now. So my own personal view is the United States should tell the Saudis to stop what they're doing, and we should not be supporting that very destructive war.
I have two more questions, and then I'm going to take some of the questions from individuals. This has been a weird era to cover as a journalist. It's probably been a weird era for a lot of people just to live through. Things that I previously thought we had all agreed upon are now being raised again as if there is a debate about them, like Nazis and child molesters running for Senate and domestic abusers in the White House, alleged. But in the last couple weeks, there's been some heinous bigotry that has shown up on the other side as well when Louis Farrakhan gave a speech in Chicago that was blatantly anti-Semitic. And it's been written about and publicized that there are people on the left, whether leaders with the Women's March or Democratic members of the House, who have had difficulty condemning Farrakhan and his language. I know this is not a problem for you because I know that you don't have ties to Louis Farrakhan and you have condemned bigotry in all its forms. But for people who are progressive and are concerned about what they might perceive as tolerance for the kind of bigoted views against Jews, against women, against LGBTQ that you hear from Reverend Farrakhan, Minister Farrakhan, what is your message to the progressive leaders who have difficulty condemning it?
I am, working day and night to stop Trump's reactionary agenda and his war against the middle class and working families and his support of the billionaire class. But what bothers me more, to pick up on your point about Trump, is that most presidents, even conservative Republicans like Texas's own, George W. Bush, understood that when you are president of the United States, you kind of have a responsibility to bring people together. You're black, you're white, you're Latino, you're Asian American, you're Native American, you're gay, you're straight, you're transgender, whatever it may be. There's kind of a sense that we want to bring our people together. And my perhaps strongest and most emotional opposition to Trump is that he is working day and night to try to divide us up based on the color of our skin or where we came from. So I am taking on Trump and will take on anybody, Louis Farrakhan or anybody else. This country, anti-Semitism is not acceptable. Homophobia is not acceptable. Racism is not acceptable. Religious bigotry against Muslims or Jews or anybody else is not acceptable. And this is not just, we as a nation, as everybody here knows. This is a country that has struggled from its inception, when the first settlers came here and did terrible things against the Native Americans, to the abomination of slavery, to the fact that 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. Congratulations, Women's International Day, by the way. All right. To discrimination against the Asians, the Italians, the Irish. That has been not only the history of our country, history of countries all over the world. I hate you because you're a different religion. All right? We as a nation have got to do everything that we can to fight anybody, whether it's Trump, Farrakhan, or anybody else who is trying to divide us up. We are strongest when we stand together, when we fight for working families, when we fight for an agenda that works for all of us, not just the people on top.
Last question from me, and then I'll turn it over. I'll read questions from the audience. Your beloved son, Levy Sanders, is running for the House of Representatives. He's a turncoat. He's running from New Hampshire, right across the Connecticut River there. That joke is funnier in New England, I guess. But what advice would you give him?
Well, it is interesting, during my campaign, what I said to the people of this country: stand up, fight back, and if you feel it appropriate, run for office. So lo and behold, my kids did that. And the advice that I would give him is the advice that I would give any serious candidate. And that is, focus on the most important issues facing the vast majority of the people. And that is why it occurs in Vermont or in Texas that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, people are working 2 or 3 jobs, because we have a minimum wage nationally of $7.25 an hour, and we've got to raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour. something that he believes in, and I would hope that most Americans believe in. All right, so in other words, run on an issue of taking on Trump and the Republican leadership who want to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, when in fact our job is to expand Social Security because people can't make it on $12,000 or $14,000 a year. So the message that I would give to my son or to anybody else who is running is, when you have a nation which has so much income and wealth inequality, where the top 1/10% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, where people like the Koch brothers and a few of their billionaire friends spend $400 million on the coming elections, have the guts to stand up for the middle class and working families and to take on these billionaires who are doing so much harm to our country and our political life.
So one of the questions from the audience, join at slido.com, by the way, SLIDO.com, and hashtag SXSW. What do you think of Trump's potential trip to North Korea? What's the influence? No, I'm not going with number one. I'm going with number three. There you go. What's the influence on Korean Peninsula nuclear non-proliferation and Sino-U.S. relationship? It's quite a mouthful. Yes. What is your response?
Well, my response is that I am very worried about North Korea's nuclear capability, what it could mean to South Korea, to Japan, to Asia, to even the United States. You have a regime which is incredibly brutal, whose sole goal is to maintain the survival of that family that has run the country for decades, who have stopped their children in order to build their nuclear weapons capabilities. So you got a very dangerous regime which now has nuclear weapons. I certainly think it is a step forward. I believe in negotiations. And if Trump is going to sit down with Kim Jong-un, I think that is a good thing. But here is the concern. I don't want to see this just as a reality TV show. There has got to be a whole lot of work beforehand, and Trump is dismembering the State Department right now. We don't even have an ambassador to South Korea at this moment. So what I want to see is not just a TV show so that Trump can avoid discussions of whatever it is that is on the front pages today. What I want to see is a serious process with backdoor channels to do everything we can to, in fact, see that North Korea ends that very, very dangerous nuclear program that they have. And if Trump's face-to-face meeting can help in that, let's do it. But there's got to be a lot of other negotiating above and beyond Trump sitting down in front of the TV cameras with Kim Jong-un.
The number one question here from Amir, quote, how do we make sure Trump is not reelected?
Well, that has something to do with why I am in Texas today. We're heading down to San Antonio in a few minutes. And why I will be in Arizona on Sunday, and why I was in Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan a couple of weeks ago. The answer is, in Trump, we are living, as Jake indicated, in a sense, in unprecedented times. I think we have the least qualified person to be president of the United States, perhaps in the history of the United States. And the way we defeat Trump is for every person in this room and all of us is to get involved in the political process in a way that we have never done in the modern history of this country. And I congratulate the people in Texas. You just had primaries the other day. Your voter turnout was significantly higher than it has been in recent years. But we have got to do more than that. People have got to understand that much of what Trump campaigned on and why people voted for him turned out to be a lie. He said he was going to provide health care to everybody. Well, he supported legislation to throw 32 million people off of health care. He said that he was going to provide tax reform for working families. 83% of the benefits at the end of 10 years goes to the top 1%. Most people in Texas or Vermont or America don't believe we should end net neutrality. All right? And on and on. So our job is to talk to people who voted for Trump, respectfully. I do not believe, not in Texas or any place else, that most people who supported Trump are racists or sexist or xenophobes. I think they are people who are hurting, who want real change in the way our government works in terms of the needs of the middle class. So our job is to tell people an agenda that speaks to the needs of the middle class and not just the 1%. But that's going to take a whole lot of work, and frankly, every person in this room is going to have to be involved in that process.
Here's a practical question. Does calling our representatives and senators really do anything?
Yes, is the short answer. Not as much as if you were to contribute $400 million. That would do a little bit more. But assuming most of you are not billionaires and cannot do what the Koch brothers do, and it's not just calling, it's emailing, it's coming out to town meetings on major issue after major issue, whether it's the gun safety issue, whether it's immigration, whether it's tax reform, whether it is health care. The Republican agenda is supported by a small number, 15, 20%, depending on the issue, of the American people. The American people don't believe we should give tax breaks to billionaires, throw 30 million people off of health insurance, and net neutrality, not protect the dreamers. That's what the Republican leadership wants to do. So our job is to call members of the Congress and give them your view. Our job is to come out to town meetings and to rallies and to marches. Think about what happened in West Virginia just last week, in one of the most conservative states in this country, dominated by right-wing Republicans. Teachers stood up and fought back for their own kids and for the teaching profession. And you know what? They won a smashing victory. In Florida, on the gun safety issue, there are not many states, as I understand it, worse than Florida in terms of opposition to gun safety, because of the very brave kids from Parkland, the high school in Parkland, and the American people. Even the Florida legislature had to make a step forward on gun safety. All right? So when people become involved in the process, whether it is phone calls, whether it is standing up and fighting back in any way that you can think of, you're damn right, it makes a difference, and that is exactly what we have to do.
Can we expect, this is a question from Anonymous, can we expect a Sanders 2020 presidential campaign, #Feel the Burn?
As you and I have discussed about 800 times, this question didn't come from you, it came from you.
It is to Jake. It's the people, it's Vox Populi. I would never ask such a thing.
Look, right now we're a long, long way away from the 2020 elections. Right now, what my major concern is, and where I am working really hard, and why I am we'll be in San Antonio this evening and in Lubbock tomorrow. They told me that Lubbock was one of the progressive centers of Texas. Is that true? Oh, they lied to me. All right. Got to talk to my staff about that. But the reason why we are going to conservative areas is to really try to rally working people around the progressive agenda, try to expand voter turnout so that Democrats can win, hopefully, the House and the Senate in 2018. And that's where my focus is right now.
Follow-up question, makes perfect sense, from Tracy. Do you think Texas will turn blue in the not-so-distant future?
That's the answer for the people in this room. Do I think Texas has the capability of turning blue? Absolutely and positively. Look, Republicans win when voter turnout is low and big money buys elections. That's how they win. In 2014, correct me if I'm wrong, Jake, I think turnout was 36, 37%.
Something like that, yeah.
The lowest voter turnout since World War II. In my state, it was a disaster as well. All right? If we can raise the voter turnout, if 50% of the people come out in a midterm elections, 1 out of 2 people, that is not asking all that much, Democrats will win in Texas and in every other state in this country. The truth is, the Republican agenda of tax breaks for billionaires, throwing millions of people off of health care, cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, not even recognizing the reality of climate change, let alone doing something about transforming our energy system. That is an agenda supported by relatively few people. Koch brothers, some other billionaires, yes, not the majority of the American people. So if you in Texas are prepared to work hard, stand up, fight back, go out to your neighbors, talk to those people who voted for Trump, make sure that every friend you have and family member that you have comes out and vote. Yeah, I believe that Texas can go blue.
What do you think about the Mercer family's influence in Washington and the White House, and why don't we talk about it?
Well, let me ask
you do.
Let me ask you that question. All right, this is an issue. Probably most people don't know who the Mercer family are. They are a billionaire family, extremely right-wing, supportive of Trump. We don't talk, CNN doesn't talk about, in any significant way, about the power of money in politics. Now, I am an old-fashioned New Englander, and we have town meetings in Vermont, and it's one person, one vote. As a result of this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, billionaires, whether it's the Koch brothers or the Mercer family, can now pour unlimited amounts of money into a super PAC and through independent expenditures bomb your airwaves, telling you how terrible the Democratic candidate is. Okay? And in my view, I worry very, very much about the future of American democracy. I worry about the trend in this country toward authoritarianism under Trump. I worry about oligarchy, where you have a small number of people controlling the economic and political life of this country. And a lot of that has to do with a corrupt campaign finance system. Now, Jake, let me ask you a question.
Yep.
Do you think CNN has spent 1% of the time dealing with that issue?
Campaign finance reform,
Yes.
or just the role of money in politics? I know we've covered the role of money in politics. I'm sure it's not as much as you would like us
But
to.
don't you agree with me that it is a major, major issue?
The role of money in politics?
Yes.
Sure. But I mean, there are a lot of people on the right who spend money in politics. There are people on the left who spend money in politics.
There are people on the left who do spend money, that's true. But I think when you look at the Koch brothers, just as one example, there's nothing on the left to compare to them. All right, they have spent over a long period of time, well over I don't want to get old in that too deep into the Koch brothers. But this issue of money in politics and the fact that when you turn on television and you see an ad ripping apart some candidate, understand who it comes from. It comes from people who want to end Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and give more tax breaks to billionaires. The media has not done, in my view, a good job in analyzing. And one of the reasons is, to be honest with you, is TV stations all over this country make a lot of money from these super PAC ads, in my view.
Well, I mean, I will just say this in defense of the media, which is, I think people in this auditorium know the name Koch brothers because we have covered them. But I don't want to, this isn't a debate between you and me. Do Democrats in Congress recognize the war on public education? Do they talk about it in those terms? And if not, why not?
I think they do. I can't tell you every Democrat feels as strongly as I do about it. There is, when I talk about the Koch brothers, you know, people know who the names of the Koch brothers are, but I doubt that many people here know what their agenda is. I doubt that agenda has almost ever been talked about, which is not to cut Social Security, but to end Social Security, end Medicare, end Medicaid, do away with virtually every program passed to protect working people in the last 80 years. Do I think most Americans know that? No, I don't. Public education is under attack. You have Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, who happens, among other things, not to believe in public education. A bit of a problem for a Secretary of Education. We have, as I mentioned before, all over this country, not just in West Virginia, teachers who are underpaid. You know what? I happen to believe that not only teachers in public schools, but I happen to believe that in terms of childcare, do you know that in many European countries, free, high-quality childcare is available to all of their children after age 1? And before that, often their moms and dads have paid family leave to take care of these little ones. These are issues we should be discussing. We should be discussing when we're talking about public education. Should we make public colleges and universities tuition free so that people do not graduate school deeply in debt? What I want to see the status of educators significantly raised. I know not to as high a degree as football players. I'm not that radical. But maybe we should understand that the future of America is with our young people, and our young people are being educated by teachers. We want the best. We want the brightest people in education. We want them respected and well paid.
So, just point of personal privilege here, because the senator has taken a couple cracks, or more than a couple, at CNN, especially for our coverage of the fact that there is currently somebody suing the President of the United States, alleging that he and his attorney engaged in intimidation against her because she has alleged that he had a sexual relationship with her back just a few months after he and the First Lady, who wasn't the First Lady at the time, had a child. Let me just say that I think it is a legitimate story. Now, I agree that you think that the coverage is excessive. I will just say, when somebody sues the president, and especially a president who has the support of the so-called religious right, the idea that he's being sued by an adult film actress for having an affair, I think is a legitimate story. So you disagree with
Two things. When I talk about CNN, Jake, it's not just CNN.
I know.
It's
You
ABC,
us the way everybody uses
CBS.
us. I got it.
Fox, we put into a different world. All right. Fox, we see as part of the Republican Party. So it's not just CNN. And as I also said, I think a lot of the if you go to my website, my social media, every single day we're using stories that come from CNN and ABC and the New York Times and the Washington Post. So, a lot of the stuff you guys do is very, very good.
Especially when we have town halls featuring you.
Then it's really good, Jake. And your ratings go off the charts, right?
Healthcare, the budget bill.
And those were very good. Those really were
just
very
saying.
Good. Okay. Just saying. All right. Is this an important issue? It is. It is, and I don't deny it. But if you turn on, and the reason I pick on CNN is the guys I don't watch much TV, to be honest with you, but I can't walk around my office or Capitol Hill, everybody has a TV on, and it's often CNN.
Good taste.
And what I can tell you is the last couple of days, almost all that I saw was our friend Stormy. And,
Wait,
so
she's
I
not
think
my friend. Are you something you want to tell us, sir?
I think that it is an issue. But I think that this kind of sensationalism, and I think this obsession with what happens within the White House with Hope Hicks, in this country, and let me, just say this: we have a lot of people in this country who are hurting. They are in pain, and they turn on television, and they want to see some reflection of their reality. There are mothers right here in Austin who can't afford good quality childcare for their kids. There are elderly people trying to get by on $12,000 a year Social Security. There are kids who can't afford to go to college. They want to turn on the TV and hear somebody talking about their reality and what we can do about those problems. So I don't deny that this is an important issue. My God, president being sued by a pornographic actress, yeah, I think that is an issue. But whether it should be on day after day after day, no, I don't think it should.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much. Thank you to Senator Bernie Sanders.